we talk about competency modeling and meeting the demands of a modern workforce, one thing that comes to mind is the war for talent. You know, we speak to a lot of leaders who say the war for talent has changed. It's different than it's been in the past. You know, organizations are in need of deep technical expertise, and the younger generation is less likely to accept traditional roles. So where does the role of competency and competency modeling sit? TJ, we'll start with you. Tell us how ETS goes at developing competency models. How do you develop competency models? What is the process that you use?
Well, since I've been at ETS for 14 years now, I would say we've had different methods of doing that. For most of the time that I was there, we used a more generic set of competencies, and they worked fairly well for us. But as we were trying to emphasize certain aspects, especially growth and innovation, we recognized that we were going to have to create our own competencies, that we're going to have to construct our own, not from scratch, obviously drawing from other sources. Egon Zehnder and McKinsey had done some work around the correlation between certain competencies and companies that have been able to achieve significant growth and innovation, so we drew heavily on that. But we thought it was really important that our officers own these competencies, and so we had a group of 30 officers in that organization, and that's not easy to get 30 officers to agree upon anything. But we started with some raw material. We went through some tense sessions as people felt, no, there absolutely has to be this particular competency has to be higher up there, and we got it down to 6. And what was emphasized, because educational measurement is a very specific business in an industry, education that is a very slow-moving industry, we started by focusing on, did you understand educational measurement, or ETS, end-to-end? Did you have technical acumen? And then the competencies such as results orientation and market insight and learning agility and relationship mastery flowed out of those. So that's how we did it, was to sit down with officers over a long period of time, take a look at what was their sense of what had made us successful in particular instances, and then derive from that our competencies.
And Rosanna, you're known for your radical thinking in the organization. What's your approach to competency modeling as Chief Living the Learning Officer at DirecTV? Tell us a little bit about your role.
Well, I guess when you think about competency modeling, in the world of the CLO treasure trove of best practices, for my money, competency modeling is the first among equals. But there's been a fundamental change, I believe, on the landscape of talent. As everyone in this room knows, talent is the competitive differentiator, and learning is the key to unlocking that talent. Our jobs is to unleash that in a way that creates both of them working together to be competitive advantage. In my view, traditional approaches to competency modeling no longer can do that. Don't get me wrong. Everything that TJ has just shared with us, I am in violent agreement with. It's got to come from the organization. It's got to come from the business needs. It's got to be outcome-based. But those outcomes have changed fundamentally on the business landscape for a number of very good reasons. To be competitive in business now, tech, economic crisis, globalization has changed the way businesses can win. And that means talent has had to change. 10 years ago, the table stakes to the high performer, for the high performer to be an A player, was be very bright, work very hard, and deliver, execute. That's no longer enough. You still must do that. But now, the high performer must do more. The high performer, he or she must be a game changer. The business must be a game changer to compete. And that means they must innovate, they must fail forward, and they must be fearless. Try that on for a minute. Fearlessness as a competency. Try measuring it. It's about as easy as measuring inspiration. If the high performer must be a game changer in their thinking, their delivery, and their leadership, then learning to unlock that must also change. In my view, learning in the workplace must be living case study based and action learning driven. And by that I mean every moment in real time, our high performers have to be learning on the job, and of course that's nothing new. Learning on the job is key. However, it must be done differently in that they must be able to apply what they learn, teach it to someone else, and drive it across the organization. This requires us to rethink learning. Learning has to be transformational. And DirecTV IT understood that. And the role of Chief Living the Learning Officer, it's quite a mouthful, isn't it? We call it L2. Think Chief Learning Officer to the second power. As L2, I'm expected to think differently about talent and building game changers. I'm also expected to deliver transformational learning journeys in real time across IT to drive high performance innovation. It's different. And living the learning, much like TJ's approach on the executives creating the competencies, living the learning has a very specific definition at DirecTV. All of it created by the entity to drive the building of game changers and transformational learning. In my mind, this births a new world of radical disruptor competencies because they're different, they behave differently, they're measured differently. There you have it.
No
And
problem.
Robert, what's your approach at Ketchum to competency modeling?
Right, thanks. I think I'll start by just giving you some context for the public relations industry, because a lot of what I speak to has a relation to that context. PR moves like this, right? So we've got about 24 to 36 hours in most of our business movements. So you'll hear a lot about that as I talk. I want to connect with something Rosanna said, which is learning. I've been in the learning field, I guess, 30 years. Learning used to be a benefit that you gave to employees as part of their getting something from the company. And now it's become a business necessity. It's become a strategic necessity to business performance. That's a huge change for our field of learning. So to talk a bit about how that happens at Ketchum, we don't so much develop a model of competency as a framework for action, okay? And that framework for action has to be related to the implementation of the business strategy. Now back to PR for a moment, we're changing like this. Our strategy changes almost every year. So in 2014, our CEO, Rob Flaherty, came up with a changed strategy for our business. We're about 500 million bucks. We're about 2,600 people globally, okay? And the new strategy was this. Our people have to be able to develop a campaign leading idea using earned content, which meant we're gathering content from consumers, which would be played out using two new models that the company had. One was a creativity model called RISK, Research, Insight, Strategy, Creative. And the other was a model called PESO, the social digital realm of paid, earned, shared, and owned channels. And he wanted our company to implement this new strategy and these two models and show competency amongst our client-facing people in 6 months. So we developed a program with a group called Nomadic, which is an online learning provider, called The Race to Make It Real. This was named by our CEO, and he named it that because he said, if we don't make this real, that our 1,600 client-facing people understand this strategy, understand how to use these tools, we're going to fall behind because the pace of change in marketing communications. So we put 1,600 of our people through this over 6 months. I'll talk more about the program if there's interest as we go. And in that program, our people had to demonstrate that they understood the strategy and apply the models in a back and forth conversation, okay? And then we, at the end, everyone who went through it developed a challenge, a business challenge for the company, and showed how they would execute our new strategy for their clients. Okay, so they had to demonstrate knowledge that they could apply it locally. So from my view, that's a framework for action related to the business strategy, and the outcome is competency, but we didn't have a model to start it. I think I'd stop there.
Well, definitely some similarities and some differences in the approach to competency modeling, to the thinking behind the idea, the practice behind competency modeling. So, Rosanna, how do you actually go about developing competencies for various roles in departments then?
Well, it's about performance and execution, right? I like very much the frame that you just shared, the framework for action. I mean, that's what we're all about here. I mean, unleashing the competitive advantage. In that same spirit, I embrace Drucker's famous quote, "Culture eats strategy every day." Well, strategies change every year. They have to be competitive. From my perspective, what has happened at DirecTV is the culture had to change. What you were looking at was a 900 employee IT organization that was being asked to deliver tremendous amounts of systems in short time frames, competing in a technology space and competing well. It wasn't enough for them to deliver on time, on budget, workable systems. They had to do more. They had to innovate. They had to take themselves beyond the edge of their limitations. That required an appetite for failure, because when you are delivering that many systems in that much of a pressured time frame, you're going to make mistakes. So that required them, their framework for action is actually built around a 12-step program around failure. And from that, a cultural manifesto emerged that defined how they execute, how they think, how they lead, how they communicate. That next generation of their culture drove the creation of the competencies that they behave in. What's interesting about these competencies is it happens every day in conversation, and they're talking about fearlessness. They're talking about vulnerability. They're going from who can I blame to who can I teach and how. And that's delivered a new kind of learning organization that talks and drives those behaviors differently. They use gaming. They use an in-house EMBA that's really not an EMBA at all, but something far more action learning driven. It's driven by their culture, and that's how they birthed it.
And Robert, how do you approach it, and do you think it's time for a change?
Yes. I think, I'm really looking forward to hearing from what's in the room, because I know we've got a tremendous amount of knowledge out there. So how do we determine our competencies? Well, at Ketchum, what we do is we have practice leaders. Okay, so we're staying with this idea of framework for action. Our practices are the groupings of our clients by industry that we need to provide public relations for. So these practice leaders are responsible for thought leadership in their field, okay? And then that is used by local HR to apply to local roles. So I'll give you an example. Our head of digital social field is called our Chief Engagement Officer, a guy named Stephen Waddington in London. And he sets out what are the primary trends in digital social media. You can imagine how fast these are changing, right? And trying to stay up on top of that and have our people stay up on top of that on behalf of our clients is difficult. What he's doing is constantly publishing internally to the organization where digital social media is headed today, this week, next week, etc. And then our people join what we call networks in which they respond to that thought leadership and take it in or debate it or challenge it. And then that is given to the local HR as their way of saying, okay, how well are you performing against that thought leadership in this field in which you're responsible for. I wanted to say just a couple more things. Again, I really like what TJ and Rosianna are saying. I would say another initiative that's happened in the learning field, going from benefit to business necessity, that's a big deal for our field, I would say. Secondly, is knowledge is created, co-created. We no longer think that we create knowledge in the center, send it out to a passive audience, they take it in and follow what we want. We think we have to co-create. And very simply, in our company, we're very largely a young company. We have a lot of people out of college. We've got, I'd say, 60-70% of our people are below 35 years of age, okay? Now, what we've come to know as the senior leaders of the company, if you're over 35 years old, you probably don't understand the digital social media as well as the people 35 and younger. And so we've come to terms with that and said, actually, we know a lot about public relations as an industry and where that goes and how to, develop clients, etc. We don't really understand where the whole field has gone to in social media. So we're in this co-creation mode in which we are listening and co-creating. We'll take our knowledge as seniors, but we're going to add your knowledge as juniors to it. And that is making the knowledge we need to then decide how do we be competent in this new field. So I'll stop there.
Interesting. How many out there actually are co-creating their competencies? Anybody who are including juniors at that level? So TJ, what do you think of that, and what is the process that you use at ETS to actually create competencies?
I think it's essential. My two colleagues, unsurprisingly, there's a great deal of commonality, even though we come from three very different businesses there. Just a quick note about ETS. So we're 67 years old, and we were founded because the College Board and a couple of other organizations like Carnegie and ACE didn't want to make their own tests. It was a different world. We'd just come out of World War II, and we had discovered how to test large groups of people with multiple choice tests at different places at the same time. And so that's where ETS came from. So the SAT, PSAT, Advanced Placement, those are owned by College Board, but we've been creating them for 67 years. We have our own tests. The largest is Test of English as Foreign Language, Test of English International Communication, and you mentioned GRE and K-12, and we have workforce assessments as well. But the reason I say that is because as with Rosanna, as with Robert here, you're trying to create a set of competencies, but you've got a business that's really varied. Our previous CEO, Kurt Landgraf, used to say we were like a giant academic research university stapled to an LL Bean. And what he meant by that was that a lot of the work is still logistics. A lot of tests are still, you've got to print out the tests, you've got to shrink wrap them, you've got to securely send them out, although a lot of people try to get beyond that security to various places. Then you've got to take them back in and scan them. There's a lot of warehouse facility to that there, while at the other end of the spectrum, there are all of these folks who are the greatest experts in educational measurement or in the specific content areas in the world. So if you're saying, well, how could you possibly have a set of competencies that's going to fit all of these things here? And so unless you co-create, you're going to end up imposing and sort of saying, well, we're going to pass down the competency to you. And I think that's not only what has to change, but my sense is from the folks we have in the room here is changing right now. For us, the North Star is value creation. And Rosanna said something about how things change and dynamic there. Value creation changes. So what created value for a customer of educational measurement in 1965 or 1985 is not what creates value for them today. Even though educational industry itself is slow moving there, the environment around the educational industry, technology, the effect of social media on testing there is rapidly changing. It's changing at an extraordinary pace there. So we took our competencies out and we learned things there. And so just one quick story on what you learn. We said, well, there's a spectrum. If you have these particular competencies, you're proficient or you're masterful or you're expert. Well, proficient, you can do it. Masterful, you can teach it. Expert, you actually can change the competency. You can rethink the competency as we're moving along. We have a big office in San Antonio. I gave this lecture about these competencies and asked people to tell us what they thought. And afterwards, one of our test developers came up and said, "You're missing a column." "What am I missing?" "Learning." He said, "Not everybody is proficient at a competency. You talked about market insight. Some of us have had our heads in books, whether it's biology or English literature or whatever, for all of our lives. And now you're asking us to understand what the customer's problem to be solved is. We don't even know how to begin. You've got to have a column that says learning." And that was critical for us to be able to do that. So that's an example of how, with that North Star of value creation, you're really sense making. You're talking about, and those, if those conversations are going smoothly, then they are not effective conversations in my experience. Because there are folks who are really stuck on what I do creates value. And when you say, if value is determined by the customer, tell me why the customer cares about you're doing 7 steps instead of 3 steps. And that becomes a difficult conversation.